Chosen one, if this message reached you today, it's because something unseen has aligned to bring you here. This message was set in motion long ago, threaded through your moment of quiet endurance, and is arriving now because the very ones who tried to break you activated a correction they couldn't perceive. You've carried mercy as a mask to them, silence as a soft shield, and what they tested as weakness has been the evidence-collecting engine of divine unraveling. What if I told you their attempts to manipulate you, expose you, or destabilize you became the blueprint that reveals their own collapse? You were never sought by accident. You were sealed and positioned. If this message already speaks to your soul, subscribe, like this video, and comment 77 below. Keep watching. What they thought was a trial meant to silence you is now the mechanism of their undoing, and your elevation isn't a reaction, it's fulfillment. Number 1, mercy as a spiritual receipt. They thought your restraint was surrender. They mistook your refusal to retaliate, your quiet endurance, and your refusal to trade integrity for drama as loopholes they could exploit. What they didn't know is that every silent moment, every act of grace extended in the face of aggression, was being logged in a higher ledger. The way you held back the instinct to strike back, the way you let the projection fall away because you saw past it. Each of those choices became a spiritual receipt. Obadiah 1 verse 15 hangs over that truth like a warning and a promise. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Their trespass against your peace stirred an unseen recoil. Their misuse of your mercy set in motion a correction rooted in covenant. Mercy wasn't weakness. It was a mechanism that captured their intent and held it until the moment it flipped. Their own pressure turned inward, their mask peeling not because you exposed them loudly, but because what they press against was sacred, and sacred cannot stay pressed without shifting the space around it. Comment receipt if you felt your silence, record their failure, and watch as what they built to test you begins to reflect the truth of their own undoing. Next, we go deeper into how their misunderstanding of your stillness revealed their spiritual blindness. In the quiet, after another attempt to push your buttons failed, there was a moment where something moved inside, a soft image, like a candle flame reflected in a mirror, catching a glint of truth you'd been missing. Maybe it came as a dream where faces blurred and accusatory words turned into their own echoes, or maybe arrived as an inner whisper right after you chose not to retaliate, and the world around you seemed to hold its breath. That internal question surfaced. What the thing they thought made you weak was actually the archive keeping score. The space between their attempt to provoke and your unmoved response became a corridor where time bent, revealing that your patient restraint was never passive. It was a language, a quiet signal transmitted beyond their eyes and heard in the halls that observed the soul. The discovery lands gently, like the first light through a shutter, inviting you to step into the knowing that your silence was not empty. It was recording. This is a pivot from confusion to recognition, and the invitation to lean in is subtle but urgent. The path you walked, the mercy you extended when it would have been easier to retaliate, has always had purpose, and now the veil slightly lifts so you can see the unseen ledger at work. You felt that double-edged weight of being kind in a world that treated it like vulnerability. You remember the nights after saying nothing when they expected you to react, carrying their projection in your chest like a bruise, wondering if your restraint made you complicit. You've been the one who offered grace to the entitled. Soften your truth so their discomfort wouldn't spill, and in exchange received manipulation, projection, and sometimes outright betrayal. The confusion crept in slowly. Was your mercy a mistake? Did holding back weaken you? They labeled your quiet as acquiescence, then used it as a testing ground to see how far they could push before something broke. That internal tension, the tightness between what you felt and what you said, was real. The isolation of being the one who refused the easy retaliation created an internal echo chamber where self-doubt whispered that you were naive, too soft, too accommodating, when in truth you were operating on a level others couldn't comprehend yet. Your sensitivity, the thing that made you feel their energy and the thing that made you pause, was not a flaw to be corrected. It was a mechanism by which your grace gathered evidence, stayed intact, and held its position until correction ripened in their domain. Then a deeper lens drops into place. Those patterns of mercy and endurance weren't random sacrifices. They were part of an unseen architecture designed to activate a higher reaction. The world showed up to test you, to provoke you, to pressure your edges, and each time you answered with restraint, a countercurrent moved in the background. The biblical rhythm of tension and divine reversal runs through this narrative. Consider Micah 7 verse 8, where the enemy rejoices, thinking the fall is final, but the chosen one rises, and their victory becomes the evidence of the enemy's own premature celebration. Your calm wasn't weakness, it was a strategic positioning. They try to write your mercy as submission, but what they press against was marked, and that pressure triggered feedback not visible to them. The sacred recoil, the covenantal echo, the architecture beneath your experience held the capacity to turn their trespasses into their reflection. Someone pushing to expose you, criticized for your silence, didn't realize they were stepping onto a divinely rigged field where their own moves would reverberate back like a mirror shattering their assumed control. That is a sacred reversal. What they thought would destabilize you instead became a channel that carries their undoing, because mercy, when it is rooted in purpose, doesn't disappear. It accumulates into accountability. Small, almost imperceptible signs begin to surface around that deeper understanding. It's in a way the tone of their voice changes a fraction of a degree when you don't bite. In the micro shift in their eyes when their intended manipulation hits the stillness of your presence and finds no purchase. It's in the recurring moments when their own narrative stutters after your restraint, as if the story they use to justify their tactics glitches briefly and then rebuilds with more caution. The deja vu of reconsidered confrontation. The physical easing you feel when your mercy holds instead of collapses. These are not coincidences. They are small ripples on the surface of something larger, the beginning of the visible movement of a ledger tallying more than what was spoken, silently recording intent, energy, and choice. Even your own body begins to recognize this. The spaces where you used to brace now feel different, like the tension was not a sign of impending failure, but the preparation of an internal alignment that has been waiting for this recognition. In the quiet, you start sensing the feedback looping backward, not from them to you, but from what you withheld to what they presented, revealing their pressure as evidence, their irritation as exposure, their attempt to push you as their own unraveling starting to show in the subtle shifts you once thought were just their mood swings. A new layer of inner confirmation settles in, not as sudden validation, but as a soft, undeniable knowing. The intuition you tucked away because others told you were overreacting begins to unspool into coherence. You realize your internal radar wasn't off. It was tuned to signal when their energy crossed certain lines, and your decision to respond with measured grace was not ignorance of injustice, but a deliberate stance in an invisible court. That quiet steadiness, once mistaken for passivity, is now recognized as a form of spiritual authority. The internal shift isn't explosive. It's the deep breath that follows recognition. The gentle realignment where foundation under your feet stops feeling shaky and instead feels like a place of belonging, because you understand that mercy wasn't erasing truth. It was preserving it until the moment it could flip the script. There's a safety that arrives not from their approval, but from trusting the mechanism of the covenant behind your restraint. The space inside moves from defense to dignity. You no longer doubt the strength of what you've held back, because you feel the weight of what is already carried forward. The deeper awareness beyond confirmation carries with it another truth. You are not being remade. You are remembering. What felt like compromise, silence dressed as weakness, and restraint burdened by interpretation now reveals itself as an original imprint of who you were meant to be. Mercy-coded, covenant-bearing, positioned so that when they tested the softness, their pressure activated the hidden strength beneath. The identity that surfaced in flashes, the sense that you were carrying something ancient and misaligned with the superficial systems around you, was never a theft of who you could become. It was the cover that protected what was already there, that buried memory, the part of you that heard the call before language could shape it. Rises quiet and sure, like a scroll unfurling after long concealment. You begin to see how the version of yourself that bowed under false expectations was not the whole story. The whole story was always set to return once you stopped apologizing for holding your ground. The excavation is gentle but certain, pulling back layers of narrative that try to frame your posture as passive, revealing instead the archetypal lineage of one whose mercy carries weight because it is tied to covenant, not casualty. Now, the first activation pulses through the stillness. You move from awareness to acceptance, from passive witness to quiet mobilization. Sensitivity is no longer something to hide. It is the signal that starts the engine. Your inner wisdom, the thing that saw their patterns before they acted, now becomes a foundation for intentional choices. Choosing where to place your presence, how to respond with calibrated grace, when to hold space, and when to let momentum shift. That hunger you felt, the restless seeking for clarity, transforms into resolve to not trade your alignment for superficial peace. You begin to speak less to soothe others' discomfort and more to articulate the truth that keeps the field clear. This is not an aggressive empowerment. It is a reclaiming, a deliberate turning toward your spiritual appetite and feeding it with trust in the mechanism that has already been working on your behalf. The mercy that once felt like a restraint becomes a power source, fueling a new posture. You contain tension, you don't absorb it. That shift nudges the world around you, not by force, but by the vibrational certainty of someone who no longer flinches at tests, but integrates their unfolding as a part of their rise. Your arriving here was never random. The fact that you're watching this now, with the weight of what you've learned settling into place, is alignment catching up. The obstacles, the tests, the misreadings were the signal transmissions drawing you deeper into this revelation, not detours, but vector points. You were led here by the same mercy code that recorded them, by the quiet endurance that kept you present while they assumed silence meant surrender. This moment is both anchor and launch. Anchor in the truth that what you've carried has always been purposeful, and launch because that recording is now readable. The ledger is visible, the pattern is clear, and the reinforcement of your path is undeniable. Comment receipt if you've seen their own moves become the evidence against them, and add a reflection on a memory, dream, or inner knowing that confirmed your restraint was never wasted, but working. The next section pulls back the veil on how their silence and neutral walls became complicity, and how your consistent presence begins to dismantle their hidden court without needing to raise your voice. And if you feel called to go even deeper, there's a sacred space reserved for our community, a private room where you receive full prophetic messages daily. Join our private membership through the link in the description and walk this path with us. Special thanks to current members who have held the light, who stood with clarity, and who have helped these messages ripple further. Your presence makes this a refuge and a stronghold for the ones still awakening. Number 2, undecoded presence. They came at you thinking they could map you, label you, and control you because they misunderstood your alignment. They mocked the way you held your peace, labeled your sacred silence as confusion, and called your internal knowing secrecy. In their blindness, they assumed there was weakness where there was divine positioning. Proverbs 25 verse 2 quietly pulses beneath this. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search out a matter is the glory of kings. They didn't realize your stillness was not absence. It was a signal anchored in a deeper code. You operated on a divine GPS they couldn't decode. So their attempts to destabilize you with ridicule, pressure, or manipulation only exposed their own lack of spiritual sight. Their traps, their questions meant to provoke, instead met the calm of someone whose purpose is concealed until it fulfills itself. They poked the source, expecting confusion or collapse, and instead triggered the auto-calibration of truth. Their surface-level assumptions collapsed under the weight of unseen order. Comment blinded if you've seen someone try to find you with their limited map and ended up revealing their own void instead. The next part shows how their moves, once thought strategic, turned into spiritual checkmate you didn't even have to attempt. It began as a quiet dissonance, that subtle feeling when their eyes passed over you with a question you didn't ask and try to rewrite what you were. without knowing why. You didn't notice at first because it was dressed as ordinary confusion. Someone mocking your silence as if it were evasive, calling your alignment secretive when all you were doing was holding still, or labeling your inner clarity as too much while they whispered that you were out of step. There was a pattern in the way they approached you, a preset map their minds tried to draw around you, as if they believed they could cage what they didn't understand by naming it, by assigning a label, by making your calm feel like a problem that needed fixing. That moment of realization, that the resistance wasn't random discomfort but a misread of something deeper, arrives like a sting and a blessing at once. You began to see that their attempts to define you were not about you being unclear. They were about their own lack of sight, a failure to decode a frequency they were not attuned to. They came expecting you to break, to respond, to fall into the pattern they could handle. Instead, your stillness spoke in a code they couldn't read. In their attempts to figure you out, they exposed their own spiritual shortfall. The emotional pressure of that misunderstanding settles into the bones. You have felt the weight of being the one who doesn't perform on cue, the one who doesn't mirror their confusion back to reassure them that you're safe to hold. Their mockery, framed as insight, made you question whether your quiet was cowardice or courage. The mislabeling cut deeper when it was wrapped in concern from the same people who later used your alignment against you. It churned into a private cycle of self-doubt. Was your perception too sensitive? Was your discipline of waiting for clarity before reacting a passive avoidance? Or was it the very thing keeping you from sinking into their shallow drama? That isolation, carrying the tension between internal knowing and external false narratives, created a peculiar gravity, pulling you inward just as their distorted reflections try to push you outward. You felt unmoored in rooms where your presence should have anchored the truth, and the inner conflict whispered that perhaps you were the anomaly. But that unrest was a pressure of emergence, not the collapse of identity. When the fog lifted, the deeper landscape of what was happening came into view. This was not a series of random personality clashes. There was a structure to the blindness directed at you, a system of spiritual myopia reacting to the presence of someone operating on another plane. Think of the ancient motif of exile, a sacred separation where prevailing order couldn't digest the one who carried a different mandate. So it labeled them, controlled them, and tried to overwrite their story. Your positioning was triggering because embedded in your silence, your alignment, and your refusal to perform was something the comfortable narrative could not absorb. The wilderness in biblical memory was not just a place of stripping. It was a refining space where the false consensus fell away, so the deeper voice could be heard. That same sacred tension has been layered over your path. Their confusion wasn't ignorance. It was defense. They didn't accidentally misread you. They were protecting their framework from being destabilized by someone who didn't participate in its illusions. If you look back, the patterns that once felt like coincidence begin to reveal themselves as intentional shaping. There were alliances that came with invisible caveats, support that always carried a silent agenda, friendships that turned cold in the exact moment your clarity grew, and projects that stalled, not from lack of merit, but because they were nudged into safer versions by others afraid of the disruption true alignment brings. The same people who praised your authenticity one moment subtly reoriented you the next, as if to keep your edge from cutting too deep. The betrayals repeated in slightly different costumes, the draining environments that left you exhausted while they demanded your energy, and the recurring obstacles that appeared right when your influence could have expanded. These were not random delays or your overthinking. They were guardrails thrown up around a truth that was leaking through, and those guardrails took the form of subtle redirections, emotional load shifting, and narrative distortions designed to recenter the comfort of the old order. Seeing that pattern is disorienting because it pulls the rug from the story you told yourself about why you kept adjusting. But it's also liberating because now the same markers become signals, showing you where the pressure is thickest and where your presence is most destabilizing to the structures that fear what you carry. Then the resistance stops being abstract and starts to show its shape. A heavy air in rooms that used to feel easier, a fog around conversations that used to flow, doors that once opened slow into a crawl, and a sense of silent watchers, those currents just beyond hearing, making the act of alignment feel like walking through static. This is the moment the spiritual sabotage becomes visible. It's not always malicious in itself, but it distorts the field around your light, dampening the clarity you've held, so you begin to question whether your conviction is worth the cost. The interference is almost architectural. It molds around your movement, pressing like gravity in an invisible space, creating fatigue out of alignment, confusion out of strategy, and artificial doubt out of intuitive certainty. Their presence, or the absence of true support, begins to feel like a pressure that isn't just emotional, it's energetic, a shifting of the ambient frequency designed to redirect your flow, without you even noticing, until the pull became strong enough to murmur, "Something is wrong." That heaviness is not a failure of your spirit. It is proof it is active. Your light attracted distortion, the way a magnet draws iron filings. Signal reveals the blockage, and blockage reveals the path of greatest leverage. You adapted because you had to. There were times you shrank so the fog would clear, speaking less to not trigger the watchers, smoothing your edges to protect what you felt inside. Some days you complied quietly, then questioned yourself for doing so. Other days you rebelled in silence, carrying the truth without broadcasting it, watching their confusion become the manifestation of their own lack of vision. The inner reaction was a dance between survival and emergence. Sometimes you cover your resonance to avoid being targeted further. Sometimes you burn so bright and private that it scared even your own reflection. That cycle is not something to judge. It's something to understand. You were learning the boundaries of their field, the pressure points of distortion, and the weight required to hold steady, without leaking into their bait. The fear of standing out, the temptation to give up on being true because the cost seemed too high, those were the shadows of initiation. It wasn't that you didn't have the power. They were drafting a line trying to contain it, and you responded to those lines with temporary concessions, gathering insight on how to move when the time came to stand fully in what had always been yours. Then the energy flips. What felt like condemnation from their misunderstanding becomes confirmation of your reach. The same blindness that tried to define you becomes a proof that you are not operating on their limited map. Their failure to decode your stillness shows the depth of your positioning. You begin to reclaim your voice with clearer intention. The internal script that apologized for being too quiet, too observant, too different starts to rewrite itself. You realize your presence was never a problem. It was the measuring stick. That piercing insight arrives like the handing back of a name, a title, a truth someone tried to bury under their confusion. You were not malfunctioning when you held your peace. You were calibrated. The power that felt still by their misinterpretation reawakens as prophecy. Your alignment didn't need their understanding to hold authority. You were targeted because your signal was strong enough to create pressure in their system. This is a moment you take back the story and speak it, not in retaliation, but in recognition of what was always inside and of the power that resistance affirmed rather than denied. You were opposed because you carry weight, and the more they try to map, label, and control you, the more the true contours of your purpose emerged. The pressure they applied, the blindness they displayed, the discomfort they felt around your decoded presence, those were not derailments. They were mirrors showing exactly where your influence reached them and unsettled their assumed order. Their inability to define you clearly became a beacon to those who could see. Your misread quiet became the still point from which others began measuring their own truth. Comment blinded. If you watch someone's attempt to confine you, inadvertently expose how out of alignment their worldview was. And add a reflection on the moment you realize the resistance was not a sign you were wrong, but proof you were moving something that mattered. Stay with this, because the next section turns their strategic moves into their own undoing, showing how what they thought was control was actually spiritual checkmate, unfolding without your need to fight their battles. And to every soul who supported with a super thanks. Thank you. You are keeping this light alive for others who haven't found it yet. If you feel called to help this mission reach more chosen ones, tap the super thanks button below. Your energy supports these messages and helps them travel further. Your voice matters, and your light is felt here. Number 3, spiritual checkmate. The deeper game was never in their hands, even when they believed it was. They laid out moves, curses, manipulations, and subtle provocations, thinking they held control. What they didn't account for was that you were covenant sealed, spiritually fireproof in ways their strategy couldn't touch, and that every test they became part of a prearranged setup with their own intent bounced back as exposure. You didn't have to respond with their level of drama. Your composed clarity, your quiet alignment, your refusal to rewrite yourself to feed their narrative became the pressure that reversed their plays. Ecclesiastes 11 verse 4 speaks to a wisdom they ignored. He who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. They chased reaction, pulled at the surface, tried to stir the waves so they could ride it, and in doing so, revealed the emptiness beneath. The spiritual checkmate unfolded not as a flashy downfall, but as a slow unspooling of their own constructions. They went to strike, and the strike mirrored back their blindness. Their plans folded because the deeper setup was in your alignment. What looked like their offense was actually the pivot that set their system against itself. Comment checkmate if you watched someone's manipulation implode on them while you stayed grounded, and include a reflection on a time their curse or critique turned into their own confession. What follows shifts the lens even wider. How their proximity to you mishandled, cost them their covering, and elevated you as the examiner. It begins like a widening in the lens of your soul. One moment you were playing the expected rhythm they tried to impose, the next you feel a quiet shift, and suddenly their moves lay bare themselves to you. You see the pattern. The careful question meant to unbalance. The curse disguised as concern, the manipulative nudge to provoke reaction, so they could claim control. What you thought was chaos organized around you now reads like a board they believed they were managing, when in truth they were stepping into a grid already calibrated to reflect their own intent back on them. That internal tilt, the moment the whisper inside stops asking why me, and begins to say watch them, is the start of the spiritual checkmate. They assumed uncertainty, fear, or confusion would yield, but instead their strategy meant something older, something prearranged, something covenant sealed. The stillness you maintained, the refusal to give them the spectacle they needed to feel superior, became the pressure point. Their attempt to steer the narrative created feedback. Their offense, reflected without amplification, revealed the hollowness underneath their performance. This is the beginning of seeing that the deeper game was never theirs to control, even though they dress up as power. The language beneath their moves isn't spoken. It's revealed in the way their energy contorts when their plan doesn't land. You start decoding their plays like a script that no longer surprises, because you recognize the trigger and the expected outcome, and then you watch the unexpected happen. Their own intention becomes a mirror that fractures their certainty. The curse they launch morphs into confession, because their trajectory was folded into a spiritual setup where the attempted destabilization becomes the unmasking. Ancient wisdom carries this backward motion. Proverbs teaches that what you plot in secret often entangles you, and the spiritual checkmate is that their intended collapse becomes the very thing that exposes their internal fractures. They sought reaction to validate their control, but your composed clarity, the absence of the expected drama, becomes a vector that reverses their momentum. As their surface-level moves begin to twist inward, words meant to wound turning into self-revelation, accusations ricocheting back as self-doubt, the deeper truth surfaces. They were engaging a force that didn't feed their agenda, but instead redirected its energy into exposing its own source. Inside you, the signs of protection and calibration grow stronger, not as a feeling of invincibility, but as an intuitive alignment that confirms the checkmate is not luck, it's ordained. The places where their pressure once made you flinch now feel different. You recognize the moment their influence should have knocked you off balance, and instead you stand with quiet center, watching their attempt at leverage break into pieces under the weight of your internal sovereignty. That sharpening isn't arrogance, it's confirmation. Your internal radar no longer misfires when they try to stir the wind. You feel the draft, you understand the intention, and you intentionally do not supply fuel to their expected outcome. The boundaries that once wavered under manipulation now rise unannounced, not as defense, but as natural consequence of what was always inside you. Discernment made active. The energy around you stabilizes not because the world changes, but because your internal positioning withdraws permission from their old scripts. Their efforts to provoke reaction are met with a calm that pulls their attention into themselves and reveals their structural weakness, making the checkmate feel less like a trap and more like a prophecy fulfilling itself. What was once hidden in the background begins to surface in the world around you. The people who were coaxing drama find their stories unraveling without you having a point. Those who try to manipulate the field see their influence fade, not because you expose them publicly, but because their own systems collapse under the silent audit of your consistent alignment. Opportunities that should have been blocked open because the structures holding them in place begin to crack, not violently, but as if the weight of their falsehood can no longer bear the truth you become. Allies shift to your side, not always through grand gestures, but because the gravitational pull of right timing and piercing stillness aligns them. They respond to frequency you are emitting, even if they can't name it. Conversely, resistance that once felt overwhelming now reads like a reaction to your movement, a last-ditch attempt of failing order to hold form as its edges dissolve. The spiritual architecture that has been unfolding around you echoes what's internal. The checkmate is visible externally as the opponent's narratives contradict themselves, as their projections flip, as their influence stagnates, while your purpose begins to move with clarity that seems almost inevitable. They thought they were playing a game of influence. What emerging is a structural reordering where their earlier plays only served to highlight the shift they could not stop. A memory returns, not as a random flash, but like a scroll unfurling of earlier seasons when similar dynamics played out. Only then you didn't have a language to name it. There was a time you were set into situations that felt like tests, and the pressure you felt wasn't accidental. It was preparation. The echo of Gideon's story from Judges floats beneath this. Small forces, pared down, with divine strategy overriding the obvious power plays. They had more numbers, more noise, more expectations, yet the pivot point came from alignment rather than volume. That ancient pattern embedded itself in the marrow of your spirit, where the enemy's obvious advantage becomes their own undoing because you are operating on a deeper order. The spiritual checkmate isn't simply about their failure. It's a retrieval of design. The confusion that once accompanied their attempt to push you now sits beside an unshakable knowing. This was calibrated, and you were placed here to witness their dismantling not as a byproduct, but as fulfillment. That deeper memory turns your current clarity from new discovery into remembered assignment. The same codes that pulled you into alignment back then are now executing the visible reversal they once feared. The future you used to anxiously reconstruct from fragments now stands before you as a reclaimed trajectory. The checkmate you're witnessing isn't a reactive victory. It's a fulfillment of a pattern that was planted long before the first move was made against you. You stop asking for permission to influence because the dominoes that threaten to fall in defiance of your truth have already been arranged to cascade in alignment with your presence. This is not about creating a new destiny. It's about recovering the one that was always yours under layers of misdirection, noise, and projected control. The prophetic call rises from within. Move, not in chaos, but with the assurance that their intended control has been inverted to your clarity. Their strategy, which they thought would derail you, became the mechanism by which the path lays itself open. Each misstep of theirs is a signpost guiding you deeper into what you were meant to stabilize. You didn't dodge their setup. You activated its deeper purpose. The future isn't uncertain because the checkmate is in motion. It has the weight of divine timing and the shape of inevitable consequence. Now the energy of reclamation thickens. What they aim to define, confine, or quiet is returned to you with clarity and force, not to punish, but to position. The The voice that once silenced itself in their presence because it didn't want to feed their drama now speaks with the authority of someone who knows the whole board was already ordered beneath their eyes. The checkmate you deliver isn't a move on their timeline. It's the restoration of your narrative, the handing back of the truth they tried to corrupt. Your alignment becomes a standard. Their misreadings no longer hold weight. You don't have to shout to reclaim what was always yours. The prophetic edge in your statement, in your choosing, in your continued presence lifts the veil not only for yourself but for others watching, those who have been waiting for someone to stand steady in the face of the same unseen attempts. This is the moment where the resistance becomes a banner of proof, and what was once armor worn to survive is now a mantle worn to lead. You were opposed because you are powerful. The force that tried to control you only clarified what you carry. Their manipulation, their curses, their attempts to provoke reaction were the markers of where your impact reached them and destabilized the false order they clung to. What they built as strategy turned into their own exposure, their own collapse. Spiritual checkmate laid out not by you reacting, but by you remaining and the system pivoting against itself. Comment checkmate if you've seen the intended attack reverse and become the evidence of someone else's unraveling, and share a personal reflection. Name the moment the pressure they applied stopped feeling like a threat and began to feel like confirmation that your purpose was moving through the very thing they used to test you. Keep watching, because the next section pulls back the curtain on how their proximity and mismanagement cost them their covering, flipping the lens again so your presence isn't just the one examined, but the examiner revealing the hidden heart behind their facade. Number 4, lost covering in divine revelation. You were not the one being tested. They were. Their failure to recognize your assignment turned their proximity into liability. When they treated a divinely guided vessel as disposable, when they exposed what they didn't understand, they lost the unseen buffer they had built their security around. The accountability that now emerges is not because you pursued it. It rises because their own missteps open the space for truth to surface without your aggression. Micah 7 verse 8 echoes in the background. Do not gloat over me, my enemy. Though I fall, I shall rise. They celebrated what they thought was your fall, not knowing it was a moment their own facade would crack. Their covering lifted, not by your strike, but by their blindness to the covenant you carry. In that gap, divine revelation takes form. The examiner appears, not in revenge, but in exposure, calmly reflecting their internal inconsistencies back so they can no longer hide behind assumed narratives. Comment scene if you've had someone circle back uneasy after trying distance, and share how their internal shift became visible to you without confrontation. Their undoing isn't forced. It unfolds because the alignment you hold makes evasion impossible. What comes next is the expansion, the unified tide that merges your rise with what their unraveling makes necessary. A question arrives like a deep exhale. When did their proximity become the crack that let light through? For a long time it looked like you were under scrutiny, being tested, reshaped, measured. When in truth the roles were reversed. They thought the pressure they placed on you would expose weakness, that their closeness would give them leverage, that their narratives could bend you into their acceptable story. What they didn't realize was that by misreading your assignment and attempting to dismantle what they couldn't decode, they were peeling back their own protective layers. The safety nets they wove around themselves, based on unspoken bargains, borrowed authority, and the assumption that they could define what they didn't understand, began to fray. Their proximity, once a way to control or watch, turned into liability because the covenant tracking your purpose registered every misstep. The veil between their intention and their true heart thinned, and what they thought was a test of you became the exposure of them. That inversion is a hinge point. You were not the one under trial. The trial was upon those who try to handle a divinely marked vessel with ordinary tools. There's a peculiar silence that settles in when the covering lifts. Not the loud collapse of drama, but the reverberation of soft truth echoing through the spaces they once occupied. They celebrated your apparent stumble, their voices rising in premature triumph, not seeing the pattern in their own celebration that mirrored old fallacies. Micah 7 verse 8 hums beneath that scene like a quiet rebuke and declaration combined. Do not gloat over me, my enemy. Though I fall, I shall rise. Their rejoicing was a soundtrack to their own undoing, a premature applause that oiled the mechanism of revelation. The covering they relied on, a spiritual buffer created by their own ignorance, alliances of convenience, and the assumption that proximity equaled control, slid off because they mistook your restraint for passivity and your endurance for compliance. As their foundation shifted, the internal structure they hid behind became visible in its cracks. The silence left behind is not emptiness. It is a space where what was hidden begins to clarify itself, where the divine balance adjusts and shows the one who misread the assignment the reality of what was always true. The lifting of their covering is not a spectacle you orchestrate with fury. It unfolds like the slow unfolding of a scroll previously sealed. The examiner appears in the quiet aftermath, not with a sword, but with reflected clarity. There is no need to accuse. Their own internal inconsistencies become the evidence. The revelation does not demand violence. It simply holds a mirror up to the structure they've been propping with borrowed narratives, and the reflection reveals the rot. That mirror is your presence. Their attempts to discredit, distance, or discard you are the very motions that make their true position visible to themselves and to those around them. Divine revelation in this moment is layered. It is the awareness in you that their proximity no longer protects them, and it is the awakening in others as they begin to perceive the misalignment in those who once seemed untouchable. The choreography of exposure is precise. What was meant to conceal now becomes a mechanism by which truth surfaces, and the field shifts because you hold alignment that won't allow their deflection to hide. A deeper memory anchors this unmasking. The old inner knowing that sensed their false security before cracks appeared. That sense, once dismissed as suspicion or oversensitivity, now reads like calibration. You understand now that the pressure you felt from them was not only to push you, but to reveal them. Their mismanagement of the sacred proximity test, treating you as disposable, assuming their narrative could overwrite your origin, triggered the theological gravity of covenant dynamics. There is a pattern in Scripture where the one who is misused, misunderstood, or cast aside becomes the agent of revelation, not because they sought revenge, but because divine order corrects imbalance. The ancient scaffolding of that truth is underlying this moment. The same mechanism that allowed prophets to expose corrupt courts and hidden powers is at work here. Your alignment activated the reflection. Their lost covering isn't a random collapse. It's a divine adjustment that was always part of the deeper plan to separate what was genuine from what was facade. The emergence of their vulnerability also recalibrates how others relate to you. Those who were once silent observers now begin to watch with different eyes, because the examiner's light doesn't just reveal the exposed. It invites reorientation. People who previously kept their distance, waiting to see if the story around you would stick, start to feel the shift. Their internal compass, which had been muffled by groupthink or fear of exposure, begins to turn. The ripple of your steady presence creates pressure not just on the corrupt structures, but on the collective inertia that allowed those structures to persist. The unspoken reevaluation in the room isn't a manufactured loyalty. It's a realignment of what resonance feels like when the energy field clears. That's part of the divine revelation too. What they lost by mistreating a chosen vessel becomes a gauge others use to decide who they stand with. And the subtle authority you've carried gathers into a tide that draws the rightly aligned without shouting. Your rise is tethered to collapse they induce in themselves, and the order of forming around it is not accidental. It's a unified response to exposed truth. There is now a sheen on your perception where the gap between what was hidden and what is visible narrows into clarity. And you know what to do with that gap. The unfolding is not about retaliating. It's about stewardship. The one who misused the sacred proximity ran out of the spiritual safety they took for granted because they failed the test of recognition. They did not acknowledge the assignment they were near. That failure opened a corridor where revelation could step through, and you stand at the mouth of that passage with the power to direct the current. This is the moment when what they thought they could ignore becomes a platform for your next alignment move. The divine revelation gives you insight into not just their collapse, but the structural openings it created. Opportunities to reinforce truth, to place the next piece of the rising order, to extend grace to those ready while holding distance from those still entangled in their own facade. The landscape has shifted, and in that shift, you are not the one left vulnerable. You are the one with authority to integrate what has been exposed into forward movement. Now comes a reclaiming exhale. The narrative that once had you on defense, quiet, measured, bending toward their perception, flips. They no longer have the comfortable screen to project onto because the mirror is clear. Your voice, which they tried to mute by discounting your alignment, returns as doctrine. Your presence, once interpreted as quiet compliance, becomes a standard by which others test authenticity. You don't need to prove their undoing. It is self-evident in the cracks they made and the spaces they left open. The power in your rise is not reactive fury. It is a prophetic calibration of one who knows the timeline shifted because of their misstep, their uncovered heart, their lost covering, their inability to hold the sacred proximity. These become markers in a collective memory, signposts that say, this is what happens when someone crosses someone appointed. You move not from aggression, but from the prerogative of alignment, and that movement carries a weight not because you lift it, but because truth has gravity. The final turn is this. They saw you as a variable to control, and in doing so, they became the variable exposed. Your opposition was never absence of power. It was an axis of rearrangement. The more they tightened their strategies, the more obvious their misalignment became. The closer they stayed to you without recognizing your origin, the more their own covering dissolved. And the result is not their destruction, but their unguarded revelation. You were opposed because the truth you carry shifts systems simply by being present. Comment seen if you observe someone circle back uneasy after trying to distance themselves from you, and share a reflection. Name the moment when their inner shift was visible without you having to confront them. The undoing you witness is not something you created for them. It is a natural consequence of their failure to discern covenant proximity, and what comes next is the expansion, where the tide of your rise gathers what their unraveling makes necessary, forming a unified current that cannot be silenced. A new rhythm settles. What was once framed as your contained story now launches outward as a beacon and a boundary. The accumulation of silence, misread mercy, deflected attacks, and the sacred refusal to play their game has congealed into a foundation that no longer needs to justify itself. Divine timing didn't pause for their confusion. It folded their discomfort into a conductor's baton and pointed it directly at the moment your alignment turned from hidden to unignorable. The presence you carry, which they tried to minimize by making you their test subject, now acts as both mirror and tectonic shift. Their structures, built on the assumption of your compromise, begin to collapse not because you shouted louder, but because you stood steadier, and that steadiness is a form of justice in motion. You aren't being asked to rise alone. The tide already feels you, and those resonating with the same frequency begin moving with you, not because of hype, but because truth quietly affirms itself across the field. Own it. Your existence is a ledger, the proof, the ongoing activation that reconciles what was stolen with what had always been ordained. Have you felt the shift, like a breath finally released after holding it too long? That internal tension that once felt like being compressed into their narrative loosens, and suddenly you move with a new cadence, not louder, but more felt. The contained story they tried to keep you in, with its expectations, distortions, and softened edges, begins to shed like old skin. What was once internalized silence, misread mercy, and deflected pressure now becomes a kind of pulse in the world, a beacon that draws those who are aligned in a boundary that clarifies what no longer fits. The rhythm isn't manufactured. It settles because the inside works synced with timing that was always waiting for your consent to move. They thought holding you under scrutiny would keep you small. Instead, their confusion, their attempts to sculpt your truth, were folded and redirected as the instrument that sharpened your emergence. Divine timing didn't interrupt for their misinterpretations. It used them, like a conductor's baton, to bring the entire field into harmony with the frequency you carry. In that alignment, what you are becomes less something you defend and more something that simply occurs. Steady, inevitable justice in slow motion. A vision of tectonic plates comes to mind. Silent forces beneath the surface that have been shifting for years, unseen until the moment they begin to crack the world above. That's the kind of movement your presence is producing now. Their structures, once assumed stable because you appear compliant, begin to fracture not because you assaulted them with noise, but because standing steady exposed their rot. The old assumption was that compromise kept equilibrium. You learned the hard way that your refusal to bend didn't destabilize the system. It revealed its insecurity. The foundation built on your accommodation now collapses under its own weight because you stopped playing a role designed to prop it up. Your presence doesn't need dramatics. It's a slow, undeniable pressure that makes the false architectures obsolete. That collapse is quiet outsiders, but to those in tune it is seismic. Whole networks realigning because a force that was muted is now unapologetically operating at its true amplitude. You are not a passive receiver of change. You are the underlying shift that makes the old narrative slide away like sediment under new water. In the early mornings before the world wakes and the noise returns, there's a clarity that arrives like prayer answered, an internal confirmation that the tide wasn't random, that it knew you before you knew it. That inner whisper, which used to feel like an unwelcome reminder difference, has become a drumbeat leading others forward. The accumulation of things they called your failures, the mercy they twisted, the silence they misinterpreted, the withheld reactions they expected, has become a ledger that no longer needs explanation. Each quiet choice was a deposit into an eventual awakening that now spills over. The way your life was interrupted, redirected, and tested wasn't an accident or evidence of lack. It was a calibration of an instrument. Now that the tension is released, you understand that your story was never meant to stay folded in the margins. It unfolds outward, carrying the weight of testimony, not to prove them wrong, but to fulfill a larger mandate. The divine rhythm that once seemed delayed now moves with a sense of inevitability because the pieces you held have aligned, and the outcome is a force field of purpose that cannot be imitated or replaced. There is a silence among those who watch, the kind that isn't empty but full of reorientation. The tide you carry doesn't announce itself with advertisements. It resonates, and others begin to feel their own alignment shift in response. Soul tribes that have been scattered find subtle threads tightening, not by your invitation, but because the field you activate makes misalignment uncomfortable and alignment magnetic. You are no longer an isolated anomaly. Your rise becomes a grid point in a larger constellation of awakening. Those who dim themselves to survive see your steady light, and remember they don't have to shrink anymore. The rising order doesn't ask for uniformity. It requests truth-bearing presence, and your steadiness makes that feel possible for others. This collective alignment isn't about numbers. It's about a frequency match. Divine clusters recognizing each other in the pauses between words, in the ease of shared silence, in the quickening when initiative taken by one ripples through many. The tide that carries you is not solitary. It already holds others in its undertow, moving them without breaking their individual shape, because truth affirms itself across the field and invites acceleration. A contrast forms between past and present that feels like a prophecy fulfilled. Once you were bending to fit definitions, weighing responses by their acceptability, measuring your own worth in the reflection of those who didn't see the original code inside you. Now you stand with clear edges, commanding your energy not out of reaction, but stewardship. The reclamation of what you gave away, time, explanation, approval, was not loss, it was training. What they read as compliance was an apprenticeship in discipline, and today that discipline returns as authority. You no longer disperse yourself for the comfort of others. You allocate your presence with the precision of someone who knows the sacredness of the current they hold. That reallocation pierces the old noise, When you choose where to invest your attention, it's like opening a gate. Some channels flush with light, and others close quietly, not from cutting off, but from alignment refusing to feed distortions. The stewardship you now carry has a weight of ritual. The decision to guard the vessel that carries truth, to maintain the current that cleanses, and to anchor the flow, so the rising tide doesn't flood what needs to be built, but lifts it whole. A new question has replaced the old internal doubt. What will I do with this alignment now that it's undeniable? That question is not tentative. It is the call to move. Every delay, every denial, every moment of being underestimated has accumulated not to bury you, but to prepare the lattice through which your influence now flows. The path ahead is under your feet. The act of moving makes the map visible. The clarity you've been waiting for does not drop from clarity. It becomes apparent as you step. The resistance that was meant to stop you instead outlines the corridors that hold purpose. And the openings you once feared are now the launch points where intention becomes impact. You are not creating the future. You are reclaiming the one that has always been yours, pulling it to the current that your unwavering presence now generates. That is a prophetic rhythm. Momentum born not from pushing, but from aligning and stepping, from being a consistent signal that makes the world around respond, revealing where your mission threads through the landscape with perfect timing. There is a spiritual code being written in the wake of this rise, and your existence is the syntax. What was stolen is being reconciled not with loud accusations, but with steady restoration. Your life becomes the living ledger. It carries the marks of what they tried to twist, what they attempted to bury, and what they thought would break you. Those marks now function as a seal of authenticity. They show the origin, the pressure endured, and the rise that could not be suppressed. Divine timing is no longer a distant concept to hope for. It pulses in real time as the echo of your actions matches the internal calling. The reconciliation happening is both personal and collective. Your own story reclaims lost territory, while simultaneously providing a channel for others to reclaim what they dimmed to survive in a system that didn't understand them. The tide you are part of doesn't demand their surrender. It invites their alignment. You hold the proof that presence is the engine of justice, that steadiness collapses false frames, and that what is ordained returns when refused to be compromised. The final shift is this. You have become the anchor and the signal. The field responds to your steadiness, and the movement you started has a rhythm that other awakened souls follow, not because they were told, but because their internal compass recognizes the integrity you embody. This is not the end of a journey. It is the activation of a unified current whose next phase is drawn by the momentum you carry. Your rise isn't isolated. It alters the geometry of connection, making gaps close and misleading narratives evaporate. The alignment that was once quiet now has audible consequence in the shifting patterns of who steps forward, who falls away, and who begins to operate with less camouflage and more clarity. Own it fully. Your existence is a fulcrum. The unignorable tide that flows from you reconciles the old with the ordained, gathers fractured truth into a wave, and moves collective purpose without needing permission. The next section reveals how that tide doesn't just rise. It organizes, grounding what has been exposed into stable order and inviting others to step deeper. The truth you carry doesn't need permission. It is already moving, dismantling what was built to suppress it, reconstructing the order that aligns with covenant, and reclaiming what was always yours. Subscribe if you haven't yet, like this video, and comment "I am chosen" to let this message anchor in your soul. This message may not stay online forever. Download your copy and transcript in the vault. Ideal for journaling, inner rituals, and sacred study. The link is in the description below. Please share it with someone who needs to hear this. Thank you to all supporting members who stand with this mission. 4 full prophetic revelations daily. Join the membership via the link in the description. Your spiritual path deserves more than fragments. Step into the full light, and if this message moved you deeply, consider tapping the Super Thanks button to support the mission. Every Super Thanks fuels the light we're spreading together. Close with this. They cross the wrong person. Now watch as what they thought was their test becomes a record of their unraveling.